Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond in for Peter Credlin this week. Well, here's what's coming up on the program tonight. Nurses are being sacked for not taking the COVID vaccine, despite vaccine mandates being lifted by state governments. I'll talk to one of those nurses who's just about to have a baby, would you believe, later. Jewish leaders are threatening to take legal action against Muslim hate preachers and public anti-Semites after basically no action from the cops. And pill testing is back on the agenda after a horror weekend of drug overdoses at a Melbourne rave. Bronwyn Bishop and Joe Hildebrand will join me later to discuss that and more. And thank you, by the way, to all our South Australian viewers who've come to say hello while I've been over here. One of the great pleasures of doing this job is knowing that you at home are being informed and entertained. So it's great to be back for 2024. Now, from next month, businesses with more than 100 employees will be forced to report their so-called gender pay gap. And you might think that's noble. Everyone should be paid the same to do the same job. And so they should, and they are. It's the law. It's illegal to pay someone less purely on the basis of their sex. It's discrimination. This is how 7 Sunrise explained the gender pay gap nevertheless yesterday.
The Albanese government is looking to deliver on its election commitment to help close the gender pay gap in Australia. Latest data shows the average weekly gap for ordinary full-time earnings is around 13%. While it is the lowest level ever, the annual difference over the course of a year balloons out to more than $26,000 or 21.7%.
Apologies for the strange music they played under that supposedly dire news. I mean, you'd think, heck, this is bad. Women are paid 13% less. Who are all these dastardly employers who take a look in your trousers and decide that you should be paid less because you don't have a you-know-what? But businesses won't be required to report whether or not they're paying people different money to do the same job because, of course, it's not happening. This quote-unquote gender pay gap they have to disclose is the difference between what all the men in the company are paid versus what all the women in the company are paid combined. Now, that's what they claim is the gender pay gap, because the gender pay gap, like-for-like employees, same job, same pay, isn't real. But this was Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, on Sunrise.
The Albanese government is looking to deliver on its election commitment to help close the gender pay gap in Australia. Latest data shows the average weekly gap for ordinary full-time earnings is around 13%. While it is the lowest level ever, the annual difference over the course of a year balloons out to more than $26,000 or 21.7%.
I mean, we're not really about naming and shaming. I mean, the results will be public, and so in this sense, you know, how people interpret that will be over to them. What we're really keen on is that companies look at it, see what it is, and then take steps to reduce it and make sure that women are getting treated equally and fairly in the workplace.
Sorry we put you through that god-awful music again, bug in the system. Now, she mentions this business about women being treated equally and fairly. Now, maybe there are a handful of companies and employers that are chauvinistic and misogynistic, but on the whole, I don't think that's true. Most employers are concerned with who is best for the task and who can make the company the most money. If that's a man, great. If it's a woman, great. The chair of this television network is a woman. A significant portion of our primetime hosts are women. I write columns for 2 News Corp publications and the editors of both are women. I don't think there's any great problem with women in the workplace or them being able to seek career progression if they want it in this day and age. But Gallagher repeated this same line at a doorstop.
And we want to see that reduce, and we want equality in terms of pay in the workplace. And this change will give us, I think, a significant boost into seeing that happen.
Equality in terms of pay in the workplace. Now, she clearly doesn't mean paying men and women the same money for the same job. We already know that's the law. She wants all the women in the company to be paid the same total as all the men in the company. But that's never going to happen. Whether you like it or not, and it's strangely controversial to say this these days, men and women are different. They naturally have different interests, are drawn to different fields. They have different priorities in life. And women have children, not birthing parents or whatever they're calling it at the moment, women. Now, women generally take time off work to have children, and they generally spend more time off work post-childbirth. Spending more time away from work to be with your kid will naturally affect your employment status. The time you take off might be the time one of your colleagues shines and puts him or herself in line for a promotion. These are the simple realities of life. I mean, if I took 4 months off work, I expect my situation might be different when I return too. Now, the federal government provides 20 weeks of paid parental leave for new parents, and that's available to both parents. One can take the whole 20 weeks, or you can split it between the two of you. And despite it being available to both parents, families overwhelmingly choose for the mother to take the leave. In the 2022-23 financial year, more than 170,200 women took government-funded paid parental leave. Only 1,020 men did the same. Women taking any kind of government-funded parenting leave outnumber men almost 2 to 1. Many employers also offer their own generous parental leave schemes in addition to the government, which lengthens the amount of time women spend away from work. A third of those are also available to fathers, according to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And yet fathers make up just 14% of those using these schemes. This is a decision being made by young families of their own volition. These are parents who've grown up in the era of equality in the workplace, who've been told that women should be at work, and they're still choosing to take a more traditional approach to parenting. And that's where we get to what this gender pay gap business is all about. In order to close this so-called gap, women would have to take less maternity leave and work as often and as long and as hard as men, whether they like it or not. It requires breaking down the traditional family structure and taking mothers away from their kids and putting them into the workforce for longer. That's what the government and the left more broadly want to achieve. They can't make tax out of mothers if they're not at work, and it helps their long march through the institutions. They can't get their hands on impressionable young minds as early if a parent is at home instead of at work. Women who want to work should have every encouragement and opportunity to do so. Anywhere there is inequality or discrimination, it must be stamped out. But mothers should feel equally comfortable to be stay-at-home mothers if they want to. If taking a year off to look after your newborn costs you some career progression, would you really trade that time in to help close the gender pay gap? The gender pay gap, as they call it, is a myth. It's simply the result of families choosing to structure their lives in a traditional way. And the numbers don't lie. They still are. No government or academic or revolutionary should be able to take that away from you. Well, major floods are threatening Victoria with severe thunderstorms lashing the state. The state's central region is being hit the hardest with evacuation warnings in place for parts of Seymour and Yea, and the floodwaters from the Goulburn River set to hit 7 metres. Joining me now is Shepparton Mayor Shane Sarley. Shane, thank you for your time. I believe you're meant to be hit in the next couple of days. How bad is the situation?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Caleb. Yeah, look, obviously a significant amount of rain has fallen south of where we are here in Greater Shepparton, and obviously that water makes its way downstream, as you mentioned, via the Goulburn River. And we're expecting a peak of around 11 metres from Wednesday onwards. They're still crunching the numbers as we speak now, and I'm expecting to get some more updates early this evening to sort of better be able to inform community what that means. But just as a starting point, a peak of a possible 11 metres is well below what we faced through our most devastating flood event in October 2022, which was a peak of 12.14 metres. So significantly lower, but we understand that there's still a lot of people that are still really distressed by what was caused in October 2022, and we're just trying to make sure that we can calm the community as best as we can and give them the most up-to-date information.
Of course, and as you say, I mean, these floods you had in 2022 were quite significant. I was living in Melbourne at the time and covering it when I was Chief of Staff of the Saturday and Sunday Herald Sun. Do you feel that you are better prepared this time given the events of last year, or I should say, not last year, 2022? I can't believe we're in 2024. Anyway, the events of 2022.
Time does go quick, and I knew exactly what you meant. So, yeah, I mean, look, you're always better for that experience. And even what we're going through right now, even at a small scale, we've been able to act really quickly. We've been able to get our incident control centre up and running. We've been able to get council staff there now that will be positioned there 24 hours until we see things die down. We're more equipped to be able to support our small towns. So you're always better for the experience, not saying that you want to go through that again, but we know we can't stop the water coming down the river, and it's about understanding what the levels mean. So if we are to face an 11-metre peak or thereabouts, what does that mean to our community? We're well aware of what it means, and we're just making sure that when we relay that messaging to our community that it's factual and they can feel really confident and comfortable about what they're hearing to be able to best prepare. But like always, and we've been saying over the course of 12, 13 months, you can do a lot of preparation work yourself. You can prepare and understand what it means if the river goes to 10, 11 or 12 metres. You can prepare food for if you're isolated for a few days and, charge appliances, do those types of things so you can be as best prepared as possible if we are faced with a flood event.
Well, good luck, Shane. I hope things aren't too bad for you and everyone else in Victoria. And, of course, stay tuned for Sky News for the latest on all of this. Shane Sarley, thank you for your time. Well, joining me now to get through some of the political stories of the day is Liberal Senator Holly Hughes. Holly, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Now, I spoke at the top of the show. You would have heard about Labor's grand plan to reduce the so-called gender pay gap. They've got this new legislation that was passed last year. It's coming into force next month, and businesses will be required to publish their salary data. Will this make any difference? I suspect it won't. But why are we so obsessed with telling women that they have to be at work when clearly on the numbers I talked about before in terms of who is taking paid parental leave, it would seem families are still choosing for mothers to stay at home?
Yeah, look, I mean, absolutely. And this whole debate over the gender pay gap has just always done my head in, to be quite honest with you, because, I mean, I took time out of the workforce. My superannuation isn't what it probably would be had I stayed in the workforce rather than spending a significant number of years at home with my children. For my sins, I had 3 under 3.5 years of age. I mean, it was a busy, busy time where I was at home with children. I mean, I should have got paid for that. But, that's the reality, that when you make the choice as a family to have children, that quite often, it does involve, as, many of your viewers would know, one of mine has special needs, so that required an extra level of step up in parenting, if you like. But there are a lot of families who make that choice. There's increasing numbers of families that dad's choosing to stay home for a little bit of time as well. So each family has to be able to make the decision that they want. But we do know traditionally it's mum that takes a bit of a step out, but it's also mum who tends to go back into casual work or reduced hours because anyone with children will tell you, whilst they might hit school age, let me tell you, that's when the fun begins, because you've got the music lesson, the sports training, the dancing, everything after, and all the running around that comes with being a parent and having children at that age. So there are reasons why overall the average income of a female in Australia might be less. We also know that more women do tend to go into those caring roles, so aged care, nursing, even teaching, some of those professions that, they don't pay as much as if you're an investment banker or the partner of a law firm. But it just seems that this government is just wedded to identity politics wherever they can find it. And I mean, that's almost like they're hunting it out to push a new identity issue to the fore. But they're now saying the individual businesses will have to report. Well, guess what? That's a whole lot more work for a business who might already been doing it tough or struggling in this current economic climate. But now let's whack another layer of red tape on you. I mean, we know no one in the Labor Party's actually worked for a real business, but this is just indicative of how they don't understand how businesses work.
I know, and I just hate how women are sort of made to feel guilty now for staying at home, as though they're some kind of traitor to the feminist cause. If you want to work. The opportunities are there. But if you want to be a stay-at-home mum, I think it's good for society. Yeah. The studies show it's good for children. forget about this gender pay gap nonsense. Speaking of nonsense, the renewable energy target, Labor's renewable energy target, would seem to be in a bit of trouble now because the Environment Minister, Federal Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, she's blocked this offshore wind farm terminal at Victoria's Port of Hastings, which Victoria considers crucial to their renewable energy job down there. She says it's an unacceptable risk to local flora and fauna. Now, I've argued all along that all of this stuff, they want to put up all these wind turbines, it's actually terrible for the environment. So maybe on that token, they've actually woken up to this for once, but the consequence of that is that it makes it harder to meet our emissions targets. We weren't going to meet them anyway, but I love that there's a little bit of a fight going on between the Victorian Labor government and the federal Labor government over this now.
Well, you'd almost think that the fight might be happening within the Labor government federally as well, because it looks like the left doesn't know what the far left hand is doing when it comes here, because Chris Bowen's out there constantly harping on about the need for renewables and the fact that we're going to have this incredibly fast transition to renewable energy, that it's going to be the cheapest form of energy. I mean, we've got more renewables in the system than we've ever had before, and find me a person whose power bills are going down. I mean, it's just an absolute fallacy. But I'll let you in on a little bit of a secret. I live in Tanya Plibersek's federal seat for my sins, but clearly the Greens are going to target her at the next election, because there are starting to be posters come up already with photos of Tanya looking at her to stop all new coal, that she's making these decisions that are damaging the environment. So the Greens are certainly going to conflate those two issues. So they're not going to be too worried. And we know in the Greens pyramid of, and as I say this, values, in their pyramid, renewable energy is at the top. The environment, they used to care about the whales, they used to care about the koalas, but that's below renewable energy. So they would be less worried about the flora and fauna, the Port of Hastings, than they are about the opportunity to develop offshore wind farms. So it's going to be an interesting debate between them, because the Greens won't be able to reconcile their two wants here of saving the environment and developing as much renewable energy as possible.
Well, I'll raise you one. I live in Anthony Albanese's electorate, so you know we're both doing it pretty tough, I think. But look, if they can't work out
I think
exactly
Tanya's
where they sit
got
on all of this stuff,
boxes packed just in case.
Fantastic. But, you know, they're not going to meet these targets. We may as well just get rid of them. Now, Peter Dutton is being criticised for apparently not doing enough to boost female representation in the Liberal Party, because there's not a single female candidate who nominated to replace former Minister Karen Andrews in the pre-selection of her Queensland seat. There's only one other federal female Lib in Queensland. You are a woman in the Liberal Party, Holly. Does the Liberal Party have a woman problem?
No. And, you know, the thing that irks me is when I stood for pre-selection, it never at one stage was part of my campaign agenda or pick me because I was a woman. In fact, I'm up for pre-selection again in April, and I certainly won't be out there saying pick me because I'm a woman. I think that if that's your biggest selling point, you probably need to look into some TAFE courses. But, you know, I don't want to comment on Queensland in particular because A, it's not my state, and B, their pre-selection processes are a matter for their own division. I do think that we've got some fantastic current female members of parliament, but we've got people like Melissa McIntosh and Lindsay, who is actually facing a challenge by a man for a seat where she was the only marginal seat holder, if you like, certainly the only one in New South Wales, who got a swing towards her, holding on to her seat at the last election. So certainly I think the female members, but, you know, more to the point, the excellent members that we have, regardless of sex, should make sure that they are secure.
I'm sorry, I've just got to interrupt you there. We've just got to take some live vision of a rocket that's being sent off to the moon, of all places. They're taking with them, would you believe it, this is coming from Cape Canaveral in Florida. This is a NASA rocket being sent off. It's the first US mission to the moon in 50 years. It's called the Vulcan Centaur, and it's got human remains on board. Now, it's going on a 45-day journey. If it all goes to plan, it should touch down on February the 23rd. 3rd, there's been a bit of carry-on over the fact that they're taking human remains with them. We'll talk to Adam Crichton a little bit about that later on. I'm sorry, Holly, that we had to interrupt there, but we're going to have to go to a quick break now. I'm going to take to you these live pictures as we go to the break. We'll come back after that. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Credlin this week. And the Late Debate, my normal show, is back tonight at 10 p.m. I won't be back there for 2 weeks, but nevertheless, please tune in for some great entertainment at 10 o'clock tonight. Now, Jewish leaders are taking matters into their own hands to fight back against anti-Semitic hate preachers after months of inaction from authorities. No one has been charged or reprimanded or anything, not for shouting "Gas the Jews" on the steps of the Opera House or any of the Muslim clerics who've threatened jihad or called for Muslim armies to fight the West. Nothing has happened. Now the Executive Council of Australian Jewry is looking at legal action against these people, including under the Racial Discrimination Act. Well, joining me now is Co-Chief Executive of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Peter Wertheim. Peter, just talk us through exactly what kind of action you are planning to take. You have things like 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act available to you. In lieu of the law being used criminally, what can you do?
Well, thanks for having me on, Caleb. There are several legal avenues available to us under both federal and state law, which would enable us to seek redress for the kind of hate speech that has been directed against our community. At this stage, we are still awaiting legal advice about the most appropriate avenue to pursue. One live possibility, as you have correctly pointed out, is a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission under the Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act. But we're not closing off any other options either.
What is the effect of all of this? I mean, obviously, if someone had been charged, and obviously the New South Wales Police looked into a number of these clerics who had given sermons talking about, trees talking and saying there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him, all this kind of thing. They opted not to press any charges because they didn't believe they had enough there to do it. I think that was the wrong decision. They should have gone ahead anyway and let the court sort that out. But without the threat of, say, jail time, what would you actually be hoping to achieve?
Well, the kind of remedies that are available under civil law and private civil actions are things like a declaration that the law has been breached, an injunction that would restrain the person concerned from repeating the conduct, and a breach of that order would then amount to a contempt of court, which could then be the subject of criminal proceedings for contempt. So it's quite a serious matter to breach a court order. So really, those are the only really two important things that we could seek. If the matter is successfully mediated, which is a possibility, but perhaps a remote one in this case, then other possibilities emerge. There can be public apologies and that sort of thing. But overall, there's a limit to what the court could do in circumstances like this. And they are, as I said, a declaration and an injunction against a repetition of the conduct.
Surely it can't be cheap to run cases like this.
You're absolutely right, Caleb. It does take vast quantities of resources, not just financial resources, but time, effort, and human input into these cases if they're fought to the bitter end, as we would assume a case of this nature would be. And there's also the possibility of other kinds of action, challenging the validity of the legislation and so on. So there can be appeals, there can be all sorts of things that can happen during the course of a proceeding. And all of it is extremely time-consuming, extremely costly. And even if we are successful and an order for costs is made in our favour, there's no guarantee that the person concerned would be able to pay those costs, which would be very considerable, and we would then have to commence bankruptcy proceedings, yet another round of legal proceedings to put that into effect.
Which is the last place you'd want to end up in. I mean, your organisation reported recently that there's been 738% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Australia between October and November last year compared to 2022, which is extraordinary. I mean, how has it been so difficult for governments and police forces to do anything about this, so you end up in the position of, having to spend significant amount of money to do something yourself?
Well, I would answer it this way, Caleb. I would say that the level of propaganda that we've been hearing, the hate propaganda in the context of the current Israel-Hamas war, and the way it's involved the brazen inversion of the truth and the hysterically emotional way it is being conveyed in public is something quite new in Australia. It's very much the way that political discourse is conducted in the Middle East outside of Israel, but completely alien to Australia's political culture. So I guess in a way it's understandable that governments and law enforcement agencies have struggled to adapt. But the end result is that we're left to our own resources and to fight this battle ourselves. I have to say, since we announced that we were going to take this course of action, we've been inundated by messages of support from not just the Jewish community, but the wider Australian community, which is very heartening. But somebody has to make a stand against the hate preachers at some point. You can't just let this thing go on endlessly, because it only invites worse forms of behaviour in the long run. And the longer you leave it, the worse the behaviour comes and the higher the price that has to be paid to deal with it. So it's best to deal with it now.
Indeed. Peter Wertheim, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, US President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, would-be again president, of course, have traded barbs, labelling each other a threat to democracy as the race to the White House ramps up. The pair were rallying on what was the third anniversary of the January 6 storming of the Capitol. Take a look.
Trump's mob wasn't a peaceful protest. It was a violent assault. They were insurrectionists, not patriots. They weren't there to uphold the Constitution. They were there to destroy the Constitution.
We have a president who's a great danger to democracy. He really is. He is a danger to democracy, and at a level like few people have seen. By delivering a massive victory in Iowa, you will send a thundering message straight to crooked Joe Biden.
Well, joining me now is the Australian's Washington correspondent, Adam Crichton. Adam, welcome. I mean, they both seem to be going for the same strategy here in some respect. They're accusing each other of being a threat to democracy. Who wins out in this situation? Putting aside the fact that, we know Joe Biden has a few issues with his mental faculties, who wins out in that debate?
Well, look, I think the truth is at the moment that Trump is winning. I mean, they've been trying this strategy. The Democrats, President Biden has been trying this strategy now for more than 2 years. It seemed to work up until the midterm elections, because as we know, the red wave that was supposed to happen back in late 22 never happened. But since then, of course, Trump's announced, his candidacy for the presidency, and he's just soared in the polls. And throughout last year, Joe Biden gave a series of speeches in the same vein as the one that he gave a few days ago, stressing how dangerous another President Trump would be, and the danger of MAGA, so to speak. But it's not worked. So look, I think the Republicans are going to win. We'll find out. The first big test is next week at the Iowa primaries, where we just see the true strength of Donald Trump's support. I mean, he's way ahead in the polls. But we still haven't had a proper vote, so we have to wait and see.
But I can't understand why they keep running this thing, that Trump is a threat to democracy. I mean, we've seen what they've tried to do, of course, to take him off primary ballots, which I would argue is the actual threat to democracy. You're basically saying we can't beat the bloke at the ballot box, so we're going to try and do it through the courts instead. And Biden said this amongst all of his carry-on the other day. Apparently, he understands power. Take a look.
I understand power.
I mean, what does that mean?
Well, I couldn't see the clip, but look, I mean, I think your central point is right. I mean, you've got Colorado and Maine trying to take Donald Trump's name off the ballot, which is the most undemocratic thing that you can imagine. Thankfully, we've heard in recent days that the Supreme Court is going to hear this case, I think mid to late February, and most legal scholars and even ones on the left of politics are saying that it would be good if the court struck down the Colorado decision 9-0. So it remains to be seen what happens there, but I think it's likely the Supreme Court will strike it down.
The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he's now warned that the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza could dramatically widen and threaten security in the wider Middle Eastern region. He held an urgent diplomatic meeting in Qatar. Have a look.
Too many Palestinian civilians are suffering from insufficient access to food, to water, to medicine, to other essential supplies. Children, most of all. We continue to raise with Israel the need to do everything possible to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and I will do so again when I'm there later this week.
Does this sort of foreshadow that the US might step up its involvement in the conflict, do you think?
Well, look, they certainly don't want to, and I think they're right to be concerned of a broader war emerging from this shocking events of 3 months ago. Of course, Israel is surrounded by Arab nations who historically do not like it at all. I mean, so far they have not joined in the fighting, but there is always a chance that some of them, or at least some of the groups within them, will. And of course, Hezbollah being the main one there in the north in Lebanon. So the US should be very worried. Look, this has no easy solution. I think we all have to hope that Israel finishes its job as quickly as possible and destroys Hamas, and then brings the war to a conclusion. But I mean, personally, I'm somewhat sceptical that that's going to be a goal that's easy to achieve, and so I don't see the war ending soon. Because it's very hard to kill a movement. I mean, it wasn't really a formal government. It's essentially it's a group that hates Israel. And, it's hard to stamp that out.
And just quickly, Adam, before I let you go and bask in the glow of the Golden Globes over there today, you reported last week that the AUKUS submarine deal could be at risk. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, well, look, Congress passed legislation late last year that basically enables the transfer of the nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. And of course, there was much enthusiasm, much excitement back home in Canberra about that, and that is all fair enough. But the fine print of the legislation basically says that the president in the future, when the transfer occurs, which I think is meant to be 2032 for the first one, the first submarine, that the president has to say that it won't undermine the capacity of the US Navy. And I spoke to some Republican advisors, fairly senior guys who I imagine will be part of the next Republican administration. And they said that it would be crazy to transfer the subs at the moment based on the trajectory of US submarine production, which is well below where it should be. And so I just think the article was really just to inject a dose of realism that it's still a good 8 years away before the first sub is transferred. And that's another 2 administrations away. We have no idea who the president's going to be. We have no idea what China's going to be doing at the time. And so I just think we need to be realistic. We need to be cautious about it, and we maybe need to have some sort of contingency.
Yeah, and here we are with a pretty ordinary defence capability ourselves, it would seem. We're not the only ones. Adam Crichton, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Caleb. Thank you.
After the break, supermarket giants put on notice for rising grocery prices. I'll discuss that and much more with Joe Hildebrand and Bronwyn Bishop after this. Don't go away. Well, former New South Wales Premier Mark Baird has launched a scathing attack on modern-day political leaders, accusing them of stoking division in society and failing to do, quote-unquote, what they know is right or what they believe in. Joining me now is former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, and Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand. Bronwyn, as we all know, you've been in politics. We're in politics a long time. What do you make of Baird's assessment of political leaders of today?
To be honest, Caleb, this is the sort of comment that makes me very cross. It says, look at me, I'm better than the rest. And in truth, you join a political party because you believe in a philosophy of that party. You've got Albanese, who's elbow the trot. That's his basis. And on the Liberal side of the agenda, you've got people who are Liberal conservative. Now, people who believe in principles, and for me it's free enterprise and the philosophy of individualism, that develops policies, and you fight fiercely for those policies to develop. Now, there's a rumour going round that Mike Baird's just resigning from his current job and he's going to run for the seat of Warringah. And let me say, if he's endorsed, then an endorsed Liberal is better than a Teal any day. But he made this very curious quote. He said about this political debate that this invariably means that people are managing to try and win elections. Now, what on earth is he trying to say about that? Of course you're trying to win an election. What's the point in being in politics if you can't put your policies in place? So, as I said, this sort of, look at me, I'm really morally pure and I'm really above all this. Let me say, trying to destroy people's jobs and put out of business small businesses with the greyhound racing issue was just a disgrace and nothing to do with Liberal philosophy. So, Mike Baird, you want to run? Get endorsed, and we'll all support that. But for heaven's sake, believe in the things that are Liberal conservative values. Believe in the things that say we want freedom, we want individualism, we want success, we want a good country. So that's my comment.
And the greyhounds was where my mind first went when he suggested this idea of, standing up for what you believe in. Now, Joe, I mean, Mike Baird may well have believed in banning greyhound racing, but we know how well that ended for him. It's one thing to say you have an open mind. It's another thing entirely to leave your mind so open that your brain falls out. You're in the game of politics. At some point, you've got to take into account what the voter and the public wants, as opposed to just what you think is the right thing to do. I mean, we elect you to do stuff for us, right?
Yeah, look, I think Mike Baird, certainly in his own life, he's been a man of incredible principle. He was going to be a Christian minister for a while. You don't get much more principled than that, in my view, although it was for the Church of England, not the one true holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Rome, but nobody's perfect.
I'm not going to argue with you on that point,
he then left politics to care for his sick and, as it turned out, dying mother. That was not something he crowed about at the time. In fact, everyone was mystified as to why he was leaving politics so early at the time. And a lot of people sort of said, he's just going to earn more money in the private sector. In fact, it was the opposite of that, but he never crowed about that. So I don't think he is crowing. But yeah, like you, I did go straight to the greyhound debacle or example at least, and think the problem with these sorts of comments is that what people think is the right and honourable and decent thing to do is often two very different things depending on two very different sides of the debate. And so while to Mike Baird and to, advisors of his they were friends with, and to animal liberationists, shutting down greyhound racing or greyhound breeding would be an unquestionably good, noble, pure and honourable thing to do. But as Bronwyn said, for the people whose livelihoods come from the industry, and I think probably more important for the people who just like to go to the dogs on a Saturday or on a Wednesday night, I think it is, and lay down a few bucks and have a bit of fun, the working man's meditation. It didn't seem particularly right or decent and smacked of kind of elitism. So I think, I think saying, don't cause division, don't stoke division just for the sake of winning elections, I think that's a pretty fair comment. I don't see how many people could argue with it. But again, if you're not going to win election, was it Gough Whitlam who said only the impotent are pure? If you're not going to worry about winning elections, there's not much point being in politics.
Well, look, going after racing is a pretty good way to make an enemy of me, it must be said. Now, 8 people, this is awful, 8 people put into induced comas after suspected drug overdoses at a festival on the weekend. They're at this rave at Flemington Racecourse in Melbourne. They all apparently overdosed on MDMA, and now the Greens, I suppose rather predictably, are calling for pill testing to be established in the state. I mean, Bronwyn, we still don't have confirmation that these overdoses were caused by a bad batch of drugs or anything like this, and you've got a bunch of young kids who are in a very bad way, and the Greens take the first opportunity to jump on it and push their political barrow.
The first thing that should be said is that kids have to be warned that taking drugs can kill you, can maim you, and make you an addicted person who is living a life which is below your potential. But there is this wickedness about the Greens who say, test the pill and nobody will be affected. What rubbish. There's a whole range of drugs that are available now, including ketamine, for heaven's sake, which is something that is new into the scene. It's cheap. And it's the one that star of Friends had in his bloodstream and he drowned in his backyard pool. I mean, the sheer illegitimacy of the Greens on this issue is disgusting. We've seen it in Canberra, where they've almost made decriminalised illicit drugs because the Greens were in power with the Labor Party. So what has to be done is to warn kids so that they know what the risks are. We had a lovely young woman die who was at Narrabeen Sports High when I was the member. She died of an overdose because her body heated up to the degree that her organs were melting. Her brother made a wonderful statement which said, understand what you're doing to your body and make your decision, but understand what it is you are doing. Because he knew, by not understanding that, he had a dead sister. There are too many stories of great tragedy because we don't tell people what can happen to them.
Yeah, and you lull them into a false sense of security by saying, well, you have your pill tested and we say it's clean and therefore you're going to be fine, and there's no guarantee that it is. Now, the Queensland Premier, Stephen Miles, he's come up with a way to fix the cost of living. Hallelujah! He's written to the supermarket chief executives, would you believe? He's asking for a meeting. He wants to go in with the federal government. He wants to call for more transparency amid claims that they're charging too much for locally grown fruit and vegetables. You had the Sunday Mail up in Queensland reported that 30% of Australian fruit and vegetable growers might walk away from their farms because the supermarkets won't pay them a fair price for their produce. So, Joe, Stephen Miles, he's got the solution. Send a letter to the supermarkets. That'll fix it.
Well, look, he's getting there. I've got to say, for someone who I've not been shy in criticising over the years, Stephen Miles has actually done something pretty sensible, I think. It's not quite the way I would have done it. I've a couple of times said that there should be some kind of prices and wages accord, as we saw during the Hawke-Keating government, where unions, government and business sit down and you say to business, all right, we'll take you at good faith, we'll take you at face value, but if you're going to call for wage restraint, then we need you to provide pricing restraint, and the government in turn can of course provide some of those services that can mean the cost of living is not as bad for people without actually directly causing a hike in wages and that risking another inflation spiral. Now, it worked once, twice, three times, and I think it can work again. But I have got to say, I reckon he's got a point. Just over the last 24 hours, I paid $19 a kilo for a leg of lamb at a supermarket just a couple of clicks, a couple of hours out of Sydney. And at the Coles I went to just before this show, it was $8 a kilo. Correct. And at the Woolies at the very same shopping centre, it was $11 a kilo, reduced from $14. Now, those prices have come way down recently, but, you know, how is that happening when
but I mean, it proves the point. It proves the point. You've got to shop around, right? You've got to shop around, and I mean, the government can't lead you down that road. They've tried it all with petrol. They bring in all these apps. You know, the consumer has to look around and shop with their feet, and hopefully that can send a message. I know it's hard when you've got the duopoly, I bought both, but we do have to start looking elsewhere. Joe Hildebrand, Bronwyn Bishop, I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Well, next we'll talk to a Queensland nurse who's been sacked from her job 2 years after refusing to get the COVID-19 jab, despite the state government lifting the vaccine mandate. That's up next. Well, experienced nurses in Queensland who were stood down after refusing to get the COVID vaccine during the pandemic are now being sacked from their jobs despite the state government lifting the vaccine mandate in September last year. And what a ridiculous situation when you have a shortage of nurses and frontline health workers to sack them for something that is no longer an issue. Well, one of those nurses is Ella Leach. She's the Secretary of the Nurses Professional Association Queensland, and she joins me now. Ella, I mean, this couldn't have come at a worse time for you, given that you're just about to have a baby. To receive that letter from your employer after the mandate has lifted must have been galling.
Okay, look, nothing really prepares you for it. I mean, you know it's on the cards as long as the disciplinary process is happening. I'm 7 months pregnant nearly. I should be focusing on the joys of becoming a first-time mum, but it's overshadowed by this process, but it's overshadowed many happy events over the last 2 years. So it's just the way it's been, unfortunately.
I mean, it just seems entirely nonsensical. You lift the mandate, so it shouldn't be an issue. Why would the state government continue to go after people who are now no longer in breach of any rules?
I think that they're just trying to double down. I mean, they're trying to prove a point with us. There's no sensible reason why they would continue with this action. We know that our hospitals are screaming out for staff. We're seeing ambulances ramped outside, people dying in ambulances. Our rural areas are really suffering, but they just continue and they will not engage on this issue. I don't know why they bothered to drop the mandate if they were going to continue firing people. I'm one of at least 50 since September 25.
I mean, it just seems like pure vindictiveness, to be perfectly honest. Now, we went to Queensland Health today. They told us in a statement, quote, Children's Health Queensland is unable to comment publicly on the employment situation, including disciplinary action of any individual employees. Employee disciplinary matters are managed on a case-by-case basis and governed by robust and equitable processes. But they've also said mercifully, Ella, that nurses who've been sacked can reapply for their jobs. I mean, how insulting is that? To say you're not in breach of any rules, but we're going to sack you anyway. But if you want your job back, you can come and ask us for it. I mean, is this some sort of weird thing where you're meant to go back and beg them and apologise and say, I'm very sorry? It just seems bizarre.
Look, in my response to my threat of termination letter, I think that was probably the third show cause I've received in 2 years. They have asked some nurses, so obviously in my role as the secretary, I've seen hundreds of these letters and they say how they've done it on a case-by-case basis, but they're basically templated letters. They lift what you've written back to them and put it in your new one and say, oh, even if we don't address what you've raised as a concern, we don't think that we haven't taken it into account, and then that suffices as an answer. And then they just terminate you. It's just disgraceful that they've been doing this to so many people. They've destroyed so many lives. I've spoken to nurses who've lost their homes over this, been living in cars. If you were in a rural area and you were working as a nurse and living in the nursing headquarters, you would be kicked out. They were essentially homeless if they got stood down.
It's just disgusting for a rule that doesn't even exist anymore, and particularly for you, 7 months pregnant. I just can't get over how awful the whole situation is. Ella Leach, thank you for your time. Well, thank you for your company tonight. I'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Up next, back again, is the Bolt Report with Andrew Bolt.